Okay, thank you all for joining me on today's demonstration on how to accelerate your API test automation with ReadyAPI. My name is Corey Vernon. I'm a solutions engineer with SmartBear, and I'll be taking you through the latest version of the platform. Before we dive in, please allow me to introduce SmartBear as a company to those of you who may be unfamiliar. SmartBear tools are recognized around the globe, providing quality solutions across the entire software development lifecycle, from planning and design to testing and monitoring. We were founded in 2009 in Boston, Massachusetts, and have grown to over 11 global offices encompassing North America, Europe, Asia, and Australia. Over 6 million developers, testers, and operations professionals from 20,000 plus companies use our tools every day to deliver bug-free software. Our company of over 500 employees also provides 5 free tools for the community, including 2 wildly popular open source tools, Swagger and SoapUI. Here is the SmartBear portfolio of tools. We provide solutions across the SDLC on the UI and API side of development, as well as different monitoring solutions. The top layer focuses on the UI products in our portfolio. The bottom layer shows the API side, where our attention will be focused today. All of our products are well integrated with some of the most popular tools available. SmartBear has been recognized as the leading solution in test automation by the most prestigious third-party research firms. That includes being placed as leaders in the Gartner Magic Quadrant for software test automation, ranking us as the highest vendor for our ability to execute for our customers. This is from 2018, but recently we were recognized by Gartner once again as the 2019 leader in software test automation. Now let's dive into ReadyAPI. ReadyAPI is a desktop application. It's available on Windows, Linux, or Mac, and it's a platform that contains SoapUI Pro, LoadUI Pro, and ServiceView Pro. SoapUI Pro is a functional automation tool which is used for testing end-to-end API scenarios and testing the API security. It verifies that your API follows whatever business logic your company requires. LoadUI Pro is used for performance testing. We use it to simulate a massive load on a tested website or web service, and it helps determine how your server works under that load and what its limits might be. ServiceV is for virtualization of an API. We use that to create, run, and manage virtual services that work similar to the real API. Also in the ReadyAPI family is Test Engine, which is a standalone tool that allows you to run your functional tests in a headless environment and automates these tests in your build process. So for today's demonstration, I'm going to cover the following areas of the tool. We'll talk about creating and data driving a test. We'll discuss the structure of our projects. We'll talk about validating different test parameters. We'll get into automation and integration. We'll discuss running our test in a headless environment, generating reports, and virtualization and performance testing. Now let's go ahead and get started. If you have any questions during the demonstration, please ask them in the QA box on Zoom, and I'll answer as many as I can at the conclusion of the demo. And once again, just a brief sound check. Please raise your hand if you can hear me. Okay. And so you know this presentation will be recorded and everyone will receive this in their inbox at the end. All right, so here is ReadyAPI. Today I'm going to show you how to get started using a REST API with a URL as an endpoint You also have the option of using a Swagger definition or a WADL file. If you were using a SOAP API, you could use a WSDL file as well. And we do have integration with GraphQL also that allows you to run those tests. So we're going to get started today with the Google Maps API. And there are a few different ways that we can begin with our URL. Here on our project's home screen, we have some modules where we can create a new functional test or a new load test or a virtual service. If we select this option, you'll be able to see some of the definitions you can import. Also, we can create a new project directly from the file folder. And here you can see if you have a GraphQL schema or a WADL or a WSDL definition or any type of open API, you can import it directly. You can also discover an API using a built-in browser that lets you create an API based on traffic to your website. Now I'm going to show you the best way to get started with a REST API, and that's going to be our Endpoint Explorer. This way you can validate the API before actually creating your test. So once you've chosen your method, you can choose a get, a post, a delete, a put, whatever method, and then selected your endpoint. You can go ahead and send a request and get a response back, letting you know that the API is valid. Once you've confirmed you're working with a valid API, you can go ahead and create a test. We're going to start with a new project. You also have the option of working in a previously created project. Next, we get some built-in assertions that come directly out of the box. For a REST API, you get your standard HTTP status assertion, as well as your response time assertion. These can be amended. You can add in other statuses. You can even remove the assertions completely and add them in at a later time. Once you've set your assertions, you'll get confirmation that your test was created. So before we run this test, I want you to take a look at the left-hand side in our navigator window. Here we can see the hierarchy of our projects. So in the project we just created, all of the APIs included will be contained on the API layer. All of our functional tests will be contained inside the SOAP UI Pro layer. All of our performance tests under Load UI, and any virtualized APIs we have will be under Service V. Inside our functional tests, our projects are structured beginning at the test suite level. These test suites each contain test cases. You can have multiple test suites and multiple test cases per project. The test cases are the container for the actual functional test that we're going to run. And these test cases are built up of various test steps. You can see some of the test steps right here on the toolbar. You can also use the hamburger next to the test step, and you can view some of the most common test steps available, as well as all of the other ones. So there are test steps for adding in separate requests, adding in data sources. There's test steps for adding in GroovyScript if you want to add logic to your test. But one of the great benefits of ReadyAPI and SOAP UI Pro is that it eliminates the need for manual scripting unless it's something that you choose to do. You can also easily convert these test steps into a load or a security test. So by right-clicking our test case, we can create a security test where we can then use some of the most common attacks to ensure that our service is well protected. Each of these scans will send a number of malicious requests to your service and try to provoke and identify any behavior that indicates there's a potential vulnerability that needs to be addressed. If any sensitive information is being exposed by your API, you'll be the first to know about it. So let's go ahead and create some data to run with the test that we just created. So here we have our REST request. I'm going to add in a data source. There is a data source for just about every type of information repository. So if you keep your information on an Excel spreadsheet or a CSV file or inside any JDBC database, you can use that information to run your test with. You also have the ability of generating data internally using the data generator. So for this example, we're going to add a property titled City. We are using the Google Maps API, and you can select the different property types from the drop-down menu. We'll select the city, but you can also use custom names or email addresses, social security numbers, phone numbers, lots of property types to choose from. So for this example, once we've selected the city property type, it'll produce a list of random cities that we can then plug into our test. So anytime that we add in a data source, we're going to want to include a data source loop so that we're able to iterate through each of those data points. Once we've set the data source loop, we can change the configuration so that it targets the required data source if we're using multiple data sources, and make sure that it's selecting the proper request. So once we've done that, we can see it's now linked to this request. Now, if we want to pull in the data contained in our data source into our request, we can go inside the request, and instead of entering the property expansion syntax manually, we can do this with the get data feature. Using get data, we can visually select the property that we want to import into our test. So simply by using point and click, we're able to select the cities contained in our data source and add them directly to our test. So now that we've imported this information, we can go ahead and run our test. And we'll see that it's going to iterate through each of these data points and run our test with each of those data points. So we can see here, we received a response back from the city of St. Louis inside Missouri. Now we can also add assertions to these tests. Right now, we only have the standard HTTP status assertion that came on initial setup. But if we want to add further assertions directly from the assertions window using the plus arrow, we'll be able to see the menu of the available assertions. So you can see there are assertions for content, for compliance, for security. There are scripting assertions, again, if you want to get specific about the assertion that you're running. And you can also add an assertion directly to your response. So inside our response in the outline tab, I can add an assertion directly to a particular JSON node. So simply by right-clicking, I can add an assertion that will check for the state of Massachusetts in each of the responses that we receive. So if I add this, we can see Missouri is the expected result. So if I run the test again, we'll be able to see some of these tests will fail. If I want to get a view of what's causing these failures, we can open up our transaction log and open each of the individual test steps that may have passed or failed. So we can see here, we're in Pasadena, California, which is not in the state of Missouri. So if we check our messages, it'll give you the reason for that failure. You'll be able to see this with each of the requests to determine what's causing these failures. Once we've run our test, we can also have these tests automated. So I can set this test up in a headless environment using Test Engine. With Test Engine, you can see the server is already started. If I want to run this test in Test Engine, we have a couple of ways of doing that. First, we can run this using our Test Runner command line tool, which we can access through the Projects tab. This gives us some arguments that we can set to automate. We can also automate the reports that we want to create. And once I've selected Get Command Line and made sure my project is saved inside a dedicated folder, it'll generate a command line that we can then paste into our CI/CD environment to run our program in Test Engine. So there is a few integrations that we can use. You can take a look at these through our integrations tab. There are different integrations for your DevOps services. There are Docker container integrations. If you want to integrate with a Jenkins or another CI/CD pipeline, you can do that as well. So if we're using Jenkins, for example, we can go ahead and create a new item in Jenkins to set this up to automate and test engine. So after we've selected the project that we're going to create, inside our Jenkins configurations, there is a third-party plugin for test engine. So from the build, we can select ReadyAPI projects and test engine, and then specify the path of the file that we just saved. So once we've selected the project that we want to create, let's copy this path. We can insert the path here. We can also specify the individual test suite if we want to run a specific test suite, or we can run all of the test suites. The same goes for test cases or different environments that we might want to automate. Next, we access our advanced settings and then place the URL for our test engine server. So here we have this set up on our local host 8080. So I'll just take that URL, plug it into this field, and then enter my test engine credentials. We can test the connection to verify that we're successfully connected to our test engine server, and then we can go ahead and schedule this build. So if we build this out now, we'll be able to see this test updated inside our test engine UI. Test engine does have a web UI that you can interact with. You can view different statistics based on the test runs that you've completed, and you can also generate a report directly from the UI. So you have a few different options of the reports that you can generate. You can generate an Excel report or a JUnit report, and it'll give you all of those passed and failed test steps. So you'll be able to share this information with both technical and non-technical users to give them an indication of what's going on with our test. So next thing I want to look at is how we can set these tests up virtually. With agile software development, it is extremely important to be able to work from different environments, a developer's environment, a staging environment, a production environment, all simultaneously without impacting the work that's going on in the other environments. And we do give you that ability with ReadyAPI. You can see here, we're inside a default environment. We can configure this and add in multiple environments. So let's add a developer's environment and let's add a production environment. These environments can work from different endpoints within the same test. So if our developers are working locally, for example, we can edit the endpoint where they'll be working. So for this example, let's have our developers working on our API locally. Once we've set the configuration, you can see the endpoint, our original endpoint in our default environment. If I then switch to our developer's environment, that endpoint changes. So now let's say I want to virtualize an API that we have in production so that I can make some changes to it and see how it's going to respond without pulling it out of production. I can virtualize this API simply by right-clicking my project and creating a new virtual service. We can use the existing API in the project, or we can add in another definition. Once we've set these configurations, we'll automatically be routed to our Service vPro tab, where I can then, for example, record all of the responses to this API. So if I set these routing options and point it to the original API, I can set this up to record all of the responses. Once I start the server, let's go ahead back into our functional test Simply with the click of a button, we're already back there. And then I'm going to add in a delay so that we can see this as it works in real time. So if I run my test again, we can see each of these responses as they're being added to our virtualized service. Once this has completed, we'll be able to edit these responses to give us the results that we're looking for. So after our test has run in its entirety, we can go ahead, turn off the server and the routing options, and then we can take a look at each of the individual responses. I'm able to see the JSON view of the responses as well as the XML. And I can also edit the status codes for each of these responses. If I want to guarantee that a response is going to give me a 400 error or a 200 OK, I can change that here. I can also make changes to the JSON directly. So if I want to make sure this virtualized service is going to return a different city, I can change this here, and the changes that I make will be reflected across the entire platform. With this virtualized service, it does behave similar to the actual API. So if I want to test the performance of my API, I can use this virtual service to do so. Back inside our navigator window, we can use the plus arrow next to our Load UI Pro, and then we'll get some basic templates that give us a nice starting point for our performance test. So if I want to see how my API is going to respond to a set number of virtual users over a certain amount of time, I can run a baseline test. If I want to see how this API will respond to a peak in users, either briefly or over a sustained period, I can set up a peak or a spike test. I can also use a stress test if I want to see what my server's crash point will be, or I can just use a default template and add in all of the assertions later. So once we've set some configurations, set the number of virtual users, I can also set up a server to monitor the behavior of my CPU under this generated load and set the response time that's allowed. Will again be routed into our Load UI Pro tab, where we can then begin our performance test. We can add in multiple scenarios to test for different performance metrics. So in our first scenario, we have a fixed load profile that's just going to give us 10 virtual users over this 10-minute time period. I can add in another scenario, and I can switch the profile for that separate scenario. So if I want to see a burst in users or a ramp up in users, or I want to see how my API will respond to random users, we can set those options here. There's also the custom option that allows me to dictate the behavior of the virtual users as they're sending requests to my API. So if you've ever experienced a crash or something like that, you can recreate all of the behavior that led up to that particular crash. Once we've set the load profiles, we can schedule them. Instead of running one and after the other, we can have them to where they run together within this same window. We can also distribute our load to various agents. They include on-premise agents and cloud agents using Amazon. So if I wanted to set up an agent, we could do that, and then I could just drag the scenario into this particular agent. I can have all of my scenarios run on a single agent, or I can have multiple agents running various scenarios. Once we've configured our load test, we can go ahead and launch the load test. As this test launches, after a brief warm-up period, you'll be able to see all of the metrics updated in real time. So we'll be able to see the number of virtual users, how many times our tests are failing, how much time they actually take, and you can also examine further statistics inside our statistics window. From here, you can add in multiple charts that will give you the statistics that you wish to see. You can also compare the statistics based on previous runs, or you can add in graphs if you wish to just see the numbers without seeing the charts. After we've examined some statistics and our test has completed, we'll be able to generate a report that gives us how our test performed under those different scenarios. This report is generated in an easy to read PDF format that we can share with all of the teams involved with the API so that they can see how it's performing under those particular metrics. Okay, so that concludes our webinar today. Thank you all for attending. I will open up the floor for any questions that you might have, and everyone will receive a recording of this session into their inbox. So if you have any questions, please put them in the QA box in Zoom, and I'll get to them as I can. All right, we received a few questions. Let me start taking a look. Okay, can we get a getting started guide? When you receive an email from the presentation along with the recording, it will come with instructions on how to get started and next steps. Next question. Can we import all of the Jenkins tests into ReadyAPI? You can import all of your ReadyAPI tests into Jenkins, yes. From the data source, how can I add today's date? There is a way you can pull in the header data, so you can access all of the metadata using the get data feature that I showed you earlier, and you can access the date if it's included inside that metadata. Next, can I select multiple test suites while using test runner for execution? Yes, you can have it specified with multiple test suites. If you just want to use 6 out of 9, for example, you would just need to separate them inside the CI platform just with a comma. Okay. When I delete a test under project, why is it still showing as grayed out font? It shouldn't. If you were to delete a test, then it should be deleted unless you still have it saved on your computer. Maybe that's why. Next. What if I have a test that relies on a response from another API? For example, a post that creates an ID and then an API call to delete that ID. If you need to access any of the information from the response of another API, you can use the get data feature to access the response from that API. So if you have multiple requests set up inside a particular test case, or if you have multiple test cases set up inside a particular test suite, you can access the previous test cases using that get data feature. In terms of a JSON-based REST API, are you able to provide a JSON schema to validate against rather than assigning each value? Yes. Can you discuss requirements, traceability, and other tools that this tool can integrate with? There are a lot of integrations that you can view from the integrations tab that will show you all of the different integrations that are available. And you can also access the documentation for each of those integrations directly from that tab. What's the difference between Load Ninja and Load UI? Load Ninja is for testing the UI, performance testing your UI, Load UI is for performance testing your API. How much will this software cost? Once you receive email after the presentation, you'll be able to get all of that information inside the next steps. I've been trying to install the latest version of ReadyAPI on my Mac. Doesn't seem to load, just getting the icon. Have you ever heard of this issue? No, I have not. I do have this platform installed on my Mac and I have none of those issues. Does ReadyAPI support testing GraphQL APIs? Yes, it does support GraphQL. That's one of the newest features added with the latest update. ReadyAPI 3.0 has a lot of GraphQL support. Do you have a ReadyAPI license to support isolated ReadyAPI installation? There is a fixed and a floating license model that allows you to install those licenses either on a dedicated machine or to share amongst a team. What version was used for the webinar today? This was ReadyAPI version 3.0. On SOAP UI Pro, can I use Load UI with multiple load agents? If you only have a SOAP UI Pro license, you only have access to that first screen in Load UI. If you need to set up multiple agents, that will require a Load UI license as well. Can test suites be stored in Git? Is there any way to commit or push them through the ReadyAPI UI? Absolutely. There is a button to configure this to Git, and you can make all of your commits, all of your push requests, all of your pull requests directly through the ReadyAPI UI simply by right-clicking your project and accessing those Git commands. Yes, ReadyAPI version 3.0 is the latest version. It was just released a couple of weeks ago. There is ReadyAPI license support. There is an entire ReadyAPI license manager that allows you to dictate the behavior of all of those users if using a floating license. Okay, so that will conclude today's demonstration. If you have any further questions, please feel free to ask once you receive your follow-up email, and we'll be able to get out some trials for you as well. And also, if you could, please fill out the poll that was just launched to let us know about your particular uses and what you're looking to do with the tool.